All right, so welcome everyone. My name is Jen Wiggins. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a wellness advisor in OITE. And I am going to be presenting the second portion of the mental health and well-being series for biomedical researchers. And so our focus today is really trauma and its impact on the workplace. For the series itself, today is the second unit, as I've mentioned. The next portion will be focusing on self-awareness strategies for positive mental health. So be sure to join us on January 9th. The best way to start the new year is really thinking about what are some of the healthy habits we want to enlist to really foster a positive mental health. For starting our conversation today, I really want people to be in a mind frame or a mindset of trauma experiences are unique to each of us. And so what I determine to be a trauma for myself might not be the same as for someone else, but it also might mean that the way I experience a trauma might be different the way someone else experiences it. So that might mean my symptom, my response, the way I perceive it to be impacting me will look different. And so when we talk today about symptoms, when we talk today about how trauma might affect relationships or well-being, really think about what is unique to you as an individual, what might be unique to others in our lives, in our environments, in our communities, and what also might be unique to institutions or other communities or sub-communities even that we are a part of. In regards to defining trauma, we often think about little t trauma and big T traumas. But ultimately, trauma is an event that creates a lasting emotional response that often results from living through a distressing event. And a big T trauma might be something that feels significant. It feels like it creates impairment in my life. And a little T trauma might be something that, made a blip on my screen of experiences. It caused me a little upset, but I don't feel impaired by it. So we really want to think about traumas existing on a spectrum, especially as it relates to the workplace environment. So today I'll go over different kinds of different examples of traumas that we can experience individually and collectively, but we also want to be mindful that it's the moment where, it looks different for each of us. And so being mindful of that. But experiencing an event of trauma, it really impacts someone's feeling of safety. Sometimes it can cause them to question or have a disagreement in regards to sense of self. Sometimes it can impact their ability to regulate emotions or even navigate relationships, because sometimes the way that a trauma might show up could be impairing our communication, or it actually might be that interpersonal reaction to someone who has inflicted a trauma upon us. Trauma can be categorized as acute, chronic, or complex. And so again, really thinking about it on a spectrum. But when we think about acute, that might be just this one-off event that someone experienced in their life, and they don't feel like they've experienced other traumas. Sometimes chronic trauma can exist, and this might be working in an intense job role for an extended amount of time or years. This might be experiencing trauma or abuse for years. This might be living in an environment that might be war-torn, so that can become a chronic stress that someone can experience. And then complex trauma. This is thinking about trauma for a lifetime of experiences. This might mean I've experienced trauma in my childhood, in early adolescence, early adulthood, or even later in adulthood. And the way those traumas start to really compound one another can create complex trauma. When we think about trauma, folks often associate it with PTSD. Not everyone who experiences an acute trauma, a chronic trauma, or even a complex trauma may develop PTSD. However, there are folks who do, and some of those symptoms we'll talk through today as well. So really recognizing that PTSD is one hallmark in the realm of when we discuss trauma, but that's not the blanket statement for everyone. And so you want to be mindful that you might have experienced a trauma or are experiencing a trauma that might not be causing, the need for a diagnosis such as PTSD. Trauma can be experienced directly or indirectly. And I think the pandemic, or at least in the past 2 years, we've experienced a lot of collective trauma. We've experienced a number of traumas that we've experienced vicariously through others, or even secondary. And so you want to think about also categorizing traumas in regards to direct exposure versus indirect exposure. And direct exposure might mean that you experience the trauma firsthand. An example of this would be I experienced an assault versus witnessing a trauma, and that being I then watched someone be assaulted. So really recognizing that direct experience can be both experiencing something directly or witnessing it firsthand. And then the indirect exposure is the secondary trauma accounts. And this can be anything from, experiencing, watching the number of deaths that we experienced through the pandemic collectively in the US and across the world. This also can be similar to watching the video footage of the murder of George Floyd. Those are secondary trauma accounts. And even though we didn't directly experience those, it really does create a space where we are feeling the trauma, we are feeling the impact, and those things just don't leave us. And sometimes secondary trauma accounts are difficult because we might say we were not the person that actually experienced that, right? We will say it felt difficult to watch that video, or it felt difficult to hear someone account their trauma. And so we would say we want to prioritize that person's direct experience, but we also have to be aware of indirect impacts of trauma. Examples of trauma. So again, this is not an extensive list, and each of us will have a different perception on whether or not these things can be considered trauma for themselves. But accidents, witnessing a car accident, being in a car accident is an example of a trauma. Acts of violence, bias and discrimination, bullying. I think people forget that bullying is often one of the ones that could be a chronic trauma experience. Those one-off instances where folks experience bullying, or even the consistent experience of bullying through academia, being in elementary school, high school, maybe in sports that you've been involved in, or even in some of the lab spaces that you exist in now. Community violence, death of a loved one, living through natural disaster. I think as we've seen climate change happening over the years, it feels a bit normalized that people are experiencing hurricanes. And when we think about it, we want to be able to give space to say, no, just because we've seen a number of natural disasters, it does not mean that this is not impactful. This does not mean that it's not traumatic, not just only for those experience it, but for also those of us who are watching it play out on television, and those of us who might have family who've been impacted by natural disasters. Losing a job or financial uncertainty, the stress that that can cause for an individual or for a family system is a form of a trauma. Loss of an important relationship. And sometimes we might say, relationships ebb and flow. They are meant to sometimes grow away from each other. But those moments where we didn't expect a relationship to end, or we didn't anticipate how the end of a relationship would impact us, can create that space of trauma or grief or loss for us. Medical trauma is another one. This is not just watching Grey's Anatomy on TV, but we're thinking about those real life experiences that people have in the healthcare and medical setting. And this could be someone who had they went in for a procedure that felt minor, and then it ended up that they, needed to be in intensive care afterwards. Or someone giving childbirth and something might have gone wrong, or it was more traumatic than they had anticipated. All those things add up to people's life experiences that we might say that's a chance that can happen. That's a normal piece. But a lot of these things around trauma are out of our control, and they have the ability to dysregulate us. And so we want to recognize that where we say these things are normal human existence experiences, it does not make them not traumatic. Moving and relocating, I think this is an interesting one, especially for this community. Folks in the biomedical research community, they move all the time. Academia, you might say, I am gonna, cast my net to go to medical school at 10 different, 20 different, 30 different institutions, and it's across the US. For visiting fellows who have traveled across the world for their studies, it's that moment where we say relocation can be hard, acculturation stress can be difficult, and depending upon what the acclimation looks like or what that environment becomes for an individual can create the trauma impact. Spiritual and religious abuse. This one, you want to be wary about. We might not all hold the same spiritual or religious beliefs. And so recognizing that, you might say that something feels abusive within a spiritual or religious space, but we want to have that person who's experiencing it to define that. But we also want to make space for folks to reflect and share something that they might have experienced that would be a spiritual or religious abuse. System-induced trauma. Many times systems are built to protect us, many times they are not. But I'll give the example of the foster care system. And so when we think about the foster care system, it's meant to create a stopgap to protect children. And so when a child might be removed from their home, it's that moment where, yes, they were removed from their home for their safety to prevent trauma from happening or from the continuation of trauma happening, but also being entered in the foster care system can create trauma. And that's the moment where we might see the development of chronic trauma or the development of complex trauma. And so again, a system, even though it can be built to help folks run or escape or be free from trauma, it also can create other traumatic events for them. Traumatic grief. And so you might say the loss of anyone can be a grief moment, but traumatic grief is the moment where we didn't anticipate this loss to happen. And this could be, again, using a medical trauma example where someone went in for a very common procedure and they ended up dying or passing away during that. Or someone is in a fatal car crash where you didn't expect that person to be lost, or you didn't expect the last time you spoke to them to be the last time that you spoke to them. That can create traumatic grief. And that's really complicated because grief is complex within itself. And then you throw traumatic grief on top of that, and it can be difficult for folks to navigate. And verbal abuse. And sometimes we don't think that verbal abuse can be a form of trauma development base, right? And it's that moment where language can be psychologically unsafe, it can be physically unsafe, it can cause fear amongst people. And so recognizing that verbal abuse can also create trauma, and especially if it can be chronic verbal abuse. We also want to take account for historical, collective, and intergenerational trauma. And this is trauma that's experienced over time and across generations by a group of people who share an identity, affiliation, or circumstance. And so some examples might be genocide, mass shootings, pandemics, racism, a recession, slavery, forced removal from a family or community, or even war. And so again, when we think about the shooting that happened in Colorado a few weeks ago in the LGBTQ club, that's a moment where many folks within the LGBTQ community, they wanted to band together. They felt the collective trauma of that. They felt the collective grief of that. And that is also that secondary, that indirect trauma that I mentioned earlier, because it also has the ability to destabilize the safety that LGBTQ folks might feel even in their own communities. Or it's the moment where they might have not already felt safe. And now this can add to what could be the development of complex trauma, because seeing the violence against other people can then also add to what they've already experienced in their lack of safety or community of concern, right? Pandemics, I think we all can agree that the pandemic was traumatic in many different ways for us. And what will be interesting about our experience of the pandemic is that it has the potential to create intergenerational or generational trauma as we move forward. As much as we say we want to get back to normal, a lot of things have changed, and it's important to recognize that within ourselves, but also within our communities. Racism, that has an institution in the US and across the world, and that does create trauma. And so the way that that trauma has shaped Black communities or Latinx communities, or even when we talk about the Asian hate crimes that started to happen during the pandemic times as well, all those things will create spaces in which people don't feel safe. And it's very easy to have that moment of, I feel isolated, or I might feel ostracized, and those can create trauma memories amongst people. Forced removal from family and community, I think this might be one that can sometimes be region specific or very nuanced of situations that people might experience this. But we want to recognize that many people have different experiences across the world, and we want to be privy to that, especially as a community that is very diverse, where someone might come and they were a refugee and they are now a scientist and thinking about what that means for them, their view of the world and their experiences in our communities. In war, I think all of us are very aware of what's happening in Ukraine right now. And so that idea of seeing war, or even communities that have been war torn for decades, all those things have the ability to really impact how people see themselves in the world and how the world sees them. And as a result, it can create trauma indirectly. And so wanting to be aware of that, I think as a collective, is important. Workplace trauma. I think we often think of all the things that I've already talked through as traumas, but we often forget that trauma happens in the workplace. And so, again, thinking about an individual person that might have experienced one or two or multiple of the traumas that I've expressed or talked about already, it's the fact that they then roll into our workspace. And so we can't say, okay, I'm going to leave the other trauma that I've experienced and only deal and navigate with what's in front of me when it comes to workplace trauma. But we want to say it's always a full picture, it's always a bigger puzzle. And so when we think about workplace trauma, it's easy to kind of put them in categories so that we can help navigate them. And so these can be stressful events, organizational stressors, physical stressors, and also external threats. So a stressful event could be death, suicide, an accident, or even grief. I think we forget that we are all experiencing life. And so what happens when we have someone in our community that passes away? How do we cope? How do we respond? What does it mean for individuals who are part of a group or a part of a space? But then also, what does it mean for us as a collective, as a lab, as an office, and how do we respond to that? Or are we responding to it? And that's that moment where mindfulness on the individual level, but also as a collective, is important. And thinking about responsibility to ourselves and to those in our community to address those stressful events that might happen. Organizational stressors. So these can be a little bit more nuanced, again, all unique to the person, but it's really the compilation of the emotional distress that comes from experiencing these. And most of them are often chronic, right? Being treated as expendable, that moment where you don't feel like your work is being validated, or your supervisor or mentor might be invalidating you and making you not feel like you are a part of the team and that you should be present and that you're valuable. That can create a trauma response or cause trauma for many folks. Bias and bullying, which I've already named, threats or harassment. Some folks might say that would never happen in the workplace, but these things do happen in the workplace and they might be on the spectrum. And also, what I might feel as harassment might not be what someone else considers harassment. But again, we want to create a space when we're acknowledging the multiplicity of experiences. Chronic pressure and work overload. I like to point those out because I think within the biomedical research field, you're saying, yes, there's always chronic pressure. Yes, there's always work overload, and it's really ingrained in the culture. But what we find is having that chronic stress or that work overload, that's the moment where it starts to destabilize us emotionally, and it can create that impact of trauma. And so some people might say, I like the high pressure. I love the having a ton of things on my to-do list, but remembering that for some other people, that might not be the case. Or that moment where you're so used to, or it's been normalized to have the chronic pressure or work overload that we sometimes ignore the symptoms or impact of those factors. Your job role, I think many folks have roles in which their jobs are, incredibly important, or we perceive them to be incredibly important. But sometimes when we're in leadership roles, especially, or that moment you are in graduate school and you're trying to power through, the idea of your role being intense or being chronic pressure or being important, or many people are counting on you, that too can create a trauma response. Invalidation, not being appreciated, which I've mentioned, isolation, and that's the moment where you feel isolated from the space itself, not the self-isolation that can come as a response of trauma, but it's that moment where you might not feel welcomed or there's not a sense of belonging within the space that you are in, which could also be connected to forms of bias or discrimination, but that isolation from those around you can cause trauma. Lack of support. And it's really the consistent lack of support, that moment where you feel like you're struggling with your work and you might be dismissed or you might be also being invalidated, that can create trauma. And then you kind of throw all these different factors together, and a toxic work environment can really exist in that moment where you might feel unsettled, you feel physically unsafe or psychologically unsafe, or even cognitively unsafe, can really foster that toxic work environment. Uncertainty. Uncertainty is a natural part of life, but I want to highlight the moment where we might say uncertainty can also create chronic stress, which also can create the piece of trauma experience. Uncertainty, a good example of this might be, okay, you've gotten news that your PI is retiring and that your lab is closing. And that's a natural part of the realm of the world, right? But it's that moment where you might not have answers of what's next for you. How will this impact my project? What does that mean for the people that I'll work with? That fear of who will be my supervisor now, or who will write my recommendation, that has the ability to create trauma for folks. Unresolved conflict, it's the moment where many of us experience ruptures in relationships at work, and that's a normal part of any relationship. But when we have an unresolved rupture or conflict, that ease that you would normally feel if you were not in conflict doesn't exist. So you're experiencing that heightened sense of self, whether it's, the moment of emotions or physical safety, or the fear of that person actually might say something to you, or the fear of another conflict occurring. All of that stuff kind of adds up. And that's that moment where the unresolved conflict has the potential to add to workplace trauma. Physical stressors, so recognizing each of us also experiences our environmental and physical stressors differently. And so to say, people are like, chaotic environment, I love it. I love the noise. I love the energy that comes from a chaotic environment. Not everyone does. And so recognizing loud noises or a chaotic environment can cause that experience of trauma. A sense of no control, fear of the physical safety. And so someone might say physical safety, we often associate maybe physical harm, like someone actually attacked me or put their hands on me or threw something at me. Those are, that's a physical safety concern. But this also can be maybe the materials that you're working with are hazardous, or the fear of exposure to those could be difficult, in regards to, okay, what is our protocol? People have to do different ways to navigate hazardous waste, for example. And so those things can cause trauma for folks. And then the adverse physical condition, this might not be the same for all of us or even in this field together, but this might be folks who are, first responders, for example, firefighters, medics, those people who are going in and that's their job to go in. Just because it's your job doesn't make it not traumatic, right? So recognizing that sometimes we work in environments that have the ability to cause these adverse reactions or just high stress intensity in general. And then external threats, and this could be anything from a fire happening to a lockdown to, a shooter or live active shooter being present, or even needing to evacuate and you don't quite know what's going on. Depending upon how any of those scenarios can play out for you, can create this space of emotional or psychological or even a physical trauma. Common reactions to trauma. So again, this is not an exhaustive list, and recognizing that trauma shows up for each of us differently, but we could experience anger. And this might not just be anger towards maybe the person or the system that is inflicting this trauma, but it might also be anger at ourselves. Why did we make this decision? Why did I choose this job? Or why did I have that conversation with that person? So recognizing that anger can be internalized and externalized. Anxiety, avoidance is a really big one. That moment where if we feel unsafe and we feel uncomfortable, we're going to avoid maybe the stimulus that caused that trauma, or even a stimulus that feels similar. So that moment where you might have had an interaction where you had a mentor who yelled at you consistently. So then you might have a mentor now where this mentor has never yelled at you, but you still might avoid engaging that mentor in fear of being yelled at again. Believing one's reactions are a weakness or invalid. Many times when we have an experience of trauma, it can cause moments of insecurity or feelings of insecurity. And so sometimes that moment where we say, oh, I overreacted, I was being too sensitive, where it actually could be that, you had a trauma response and now it feels that you are weak or that your experience is invalid because of the trauma experience. And so in recognizing that sometimes even our beliefs in response to trauma cannot be accurate all the time, right? And so understanding how we've internalized the trauma is really important when it comes to our cognitions. Loss of trust, and that could be, again, internal or external. So loss of trust might be we lose trust within ourselves to make good decisions or make right decisions for ourselves. But it also might mean we don't trust the system. That moment where you might have reported an abuse or harassment or something that made you uncomfortable, and you now lose trust in that system because they didn't respond the way that you wanted, or they didn't respond at all, or they might have invalidated your experience. So recognizing that loss in trust in that system could be your response. or the loss of trust in yourself of, oh yeah, I don't think that I made a good decision, can sometimes create that disconnect for us on an individual level. Difficulty relaxing, distractibility, grief, helplessness or hopelessness, humiliation, that moment where we might say verbal abuse exists in the workplace, or that moment where you felt that you were put on display and then humiliated in front of others, that then can be a response that you have. You might then be internalizing that, oh, now my peers think this way of me because my PI said this to me, or my mentor said this in front of others. Or this could be something that happens even in the home space. And so understanding that humiliation is a valid feeling in response to trauma. Hyperarousal, impaired memory, and this can look different for folks. So sometimes when people experience a trauma, it might be memory impairment that looks like, oh, I forgot what I was really going upstairs to get, but that also could be a normal response to us navigating life. But impaired memory might mean I also am missing chunks of time in my life, or I only have snapshots of memory of what happened during the event. Or folks might come to after a car accident and they say, last thing I remember, I was in my car slamming on my brakes. And so recognizing impaired memory can look different as a common reaction to trauma. Irregular eating patterns. Many times folks, when they experience trauma, you might say, I've actually lost my appetite, or I find myself overeating in my anxiety or stress response, or even with my depressive symptoms. And so that moment where we might be hyper aroused and say, I don't have an appetite, can be that trauma response. Irritability, nightmares, or sleep disturbance. And this is a good one to think about, where folks are like, oh, I don't get sleep. Good sleep is not something that I experience. But that moment where we're experiencing chronic stress, the high intensity of this kind of work environment can be what's leading to the sleep disturbance. And so, no, it doesn't have to necessarily be that you feel that the work is traumatic, but you want to be mindful of how these things are coming up and how it's impairing or impacting functioning. Numbness or the use of numbing behaviors. In the pandemic, we saw the normalization of substance use or video game play, or binge watching television shows. Many of these are numbing behaviors. Or doom scrolling. We saw a big one in the pandemic where folks want to know the information, but then they're finding themselves feeling overwhelmed by the information, and it becomes again that indirect trauma and that numbing behavior that we were using to really respond to that trauma. Overworking and perfectionism, I think very, very important here to think to the uniqueness of this community. And so some folks have difficulty letting go of perfectionism in general, but we do want to acknowledge that perfectionism is truly something that is a fixed mindset, and it doesn't allow us to lean into opportunity and growth. But as it relates to trauma, so if we think back to this idea of maybe being invalidated in the workspace, or feeling like you are not doing good work or producing good data, that can trigger you to experience this need to want to lean into perfectionism. And that perfectionism is then trying to buffer for what you feel like you might be lacking, or what someone has told you that you were lacking, which then can lead to overwork, which then can lead to burnout. And so all these, again, are puzzle pieces that fit together that have the ability to impair our mental health and our overall well-being. Shame and guilt are another. Shame and guilt are very common responses to all kinds of trauma. And so really understanding what's our relationship to shame and guilt, how does that relate to the trauma experiences we had, and then how does that then show up in our day-to-day functioning. And shock, that's a common one when we see on TV or in movies, when folks have experienced something traumatic, they're in shock, they can't speak, they're trying to respond, or their fight, fright, freeze mechanism kicks in and they're frozen. And so understanding that these can sometimes just be in isolation, but also sometimes one compounds the other, or we see multiple and it's hard to discern what is the core root of any of them. So again, not taking these as snapshot pictures, but really putting all the puzzle pieces together. Impact on the workplace. So obviously there were a ton of symptoms there and the way they can show up for any of us. but it relates to the workplace because, again, we are human beings and we bring all of our experiences to each environment, to each interaction that we engage in. So, of course, it naturally has an impact on the workplace. And so it's important for us to recognize, what does that mean? What does that look like? And are there ways in which we can strategize to address trauma? Because trauma is a natural part of life. It's an unfortunate part of the human condition. It doesn't mean that we don't have the ability to really build tools or build safeguards in our community to address and respond to trauma. So when we think about how trauma impacts the workplace, it can show up differently for everyone, just like all of these factors. But when we think about an abrupt career change, that moment where someone was so dedicated to finishing out their PhD, or the person was, a tenure track and they're like, oh yes, this is where I'm headed, this is what I want to do. But they might experience a number of traumas that then they're having difficulty making decisions. They might feel like this isn't the career direction for them, or they actually experienced the trauma and it told them that they might want to shift gears and they feel that it's best for them. So this can be experienced in the way of, folks might say, oh, we lost a great scientist, where it's that actually might have been best for that person due to the history or their experiences. Or we might say we lost a great scientist and it was because they might not have had the support or resources that would have been necessary for them to stay on their continued path. Burnout or turnover, communication breakdowns. So when we think about those symptoms that I mentioned, they impact multiple parts of our functioning. And so communication breakdowns become a natural part, right? In that moment where I might be hyper aroused, or I'm not sleeping, or I'm not eating regularly, of course, I'm not going to be able to effectively communicate, or I might not, feel that I can be honest or transparent because of how the comment or culture is in my space. And so communication will break down amongst people. And that doesn't mean just with your supervisor, it also can be with your peers. Science is very collaborative, and that moment where communication breakdowns happen, which then can impact the interpersonal relationships that are there, that deterioration can really not just impact an individual, it can really impact the lab overall. Hypervigilance, which we've mentioned, increase in absenteeism. When we think about absenteeism, we often want to think about it physically, mentally, or cognitively, but also emotionally. That moment where you might say, I've lost my passion after having that interaction or that traumatic experience. Or you might say, I actually am calling out of work or showing up late to work due to this trauma experience, or my avoidance is now causing me to be late to work or to be absent. Or people actually do experience traumas that they need to take time off from work. And that's the moment where we want to be able to encourage and have people to feel that they are able to be absent when they are coping or recovering from a trauma. Interpersonal conflict or relationship deterioration, isolation or lack of connectivity. And this is one to think about from the isolating internal versus external. Many times to keep ourselves safe, because of trauma causes that moment, causes the feeling of not feeling safe. We want to control for that as much as we can. And so sometimes that can cause us to self-isolate as a protective factor. And this could be anything from experiencing bias or discrimination in the workplace. They might have experienced a microaggression, so they might self-isolate in that moment of, I need to protect myself, I want to limit interactions with others. Or some of the trauma pieces are that they are being isolated by others, causing that lack of connectivity. But what's difficult is, as humans, we need that connectivity, and it's actually one of the protective features that allow us to effectively navigate through trauma. So we want to be mindful of the lack of connectivity that's caused by a system, but also chosen by an individual, and the potential impact of that. Job dissatisfaction, that moment where you might have experienced a trauma in the workplace or outside of the workplace, but it's now leaning to you saying, I actually don't feel engaged in my work anymore. I'm not excited about this project. I don't really want to collaborate with the folks that I've been working with on this. And that then can lead to other things like turnover or abrupt career change. So recognizing that many of these things don't happen in isolation, or the longer that these negative or unhealthy impacts are happening in the workplace, they then can lead to some of the others. Loss of productivity and motivation. I think this is a big one. What's difficult is that sometimes we can't always troubleshoot where the loss of productivity or motivation are coming from. And it's stigmatized in the workplace, in the biomedical research field specifically, because productivity is what everyone focuses on, right? And that's that moment when you lose that, it can then create some of the shame or guilt, or it can compound some of the shame or guilt that you're all feeling, that you were already feeling. And so it's that moment where it can be then interwoven, and it's hard to tell which thing came first. It's hard to tell what's at the core, but recognizing it as one piece. Misunderstanding interactions. Many times we have experienced trauma, it's the moment where we might be hypersensitive to what people are saying or doing, or if we're in one of those unresolved conflict situations where, I've never really let go that thing that my mentor said to me a few weeks ago, and now we're having another interaction, and I might be perceiving this differently than is actually really at face value. And so understanding that the misunderstanding of interactions can happen because of some of the types of trauma that we experience, or it can shape our perception of how we're interacting with people and who we're interacting with, and how we're then internalizing those interactions. Poor communication, poor self-esteem or self-efficacy. And what's important to acknowledge here is that many folks deal with imposter fears. And if I'm already dealing with imposter fears, and then I experience trauma or I have complex trauma, it then can compound. And then that experience of poor self-esteem or self-efficacy or regaining identity can be difficult. It can result in unclear goals, that moment where you knew the direction of a project, or now you don't, or you knew what your career trajectory is, and you say, I don't even know if I want to be a researcher anymore after that experience. And so it can sometimes create a murky water for us to try and navigate when it comes to those goals. Unrealistic expectations, and this could be related to the perfectionism that could be the result of the trauma, where we sometimes want to overwork and overcorrect and then develop unrealistic expectations for ourselves, or sometimes our cognitive distortions can create unrealistic expectations at the hand of others, right? That moment where I might be utilizing the mind reading distortion or the future, like the fortune telling distortion, and now these unrealistic expectations exist. And sometimes that can be unmanageable when it comes to emotion regulation, strategic planning, really navigating what our goals are. Wage loss and increase in expenses. So depending upon what the trauma is, if it's a health related one, for example, or if I decide that I want to go to therapy and it isn't covered by my health insurance, that's an increase in expenses, right? So that moment where we want to be recognizing that sometimes, it's something that feels straightforward as a solution, it might cost funds that I don't have, which then can add to the trauma that I am experiencing. And then vicarious trauma, and this could be related to anything from the indirect trauma that I mentioned, or the direct trauma, but you are witnessing it and not experiencing it firsthand, or helping and supporting those who are experiencing trauma. Vicarious trauma is important to pay attention to because it can then show up in our lives in different ways that we didn't anticipate. Strategizing. So things we want to keep in mind as we think about how do we really navigate the trauma, how it shows up in the workplace, what does it mean for each of us, and then how do we be keeping institutions held accountable, right? Institutions held accountable. So addressing trauma must happen on multiple levels: people, environments, protocols, policies can cause trauma, but they also influence the response and recovery to a trauma. And so I think we understand how other folks can inflict trauma, but in an environment that might be fast-paced, intense, you don't always catch the opportunity to have a break. Those things can create trauma. Protocols and policies that might not be flexible enough depending on a person's identity or their needs can also cause trauma. But the expectation to say, oh, I don't feel like I can take time off, that's a policy, right? So if I experience a trauma that is significant and it's causing impairment and I need time off, what does it mean to say that this policy is supportive or unsupportive? And we want to recognize that policies play a role and people play a role. Don't forget about complex trauma. It's the moment where we tend to look at these things in isolation, but we don't know what people's life experiences are for the most part. And so many folks come to the workplace with trauma, and we don't want to make assumptions about someone's experience, and we don't necessarily need to know what their experiences are. But it's that moment where we want to give people the benefit of the doubt, because that moment where you might say, oh yeah, I don't think that experience in the lab was that big of a deal, but you don't know someone's history. And by not knowing their history, we can make assumptions that can be harmful. Remember the 4 R's. I think this is an easy one. Realize that an event has happened and that folks are impacted. And I think we saw this in OITE. And I think Dr. Milgram did a really good job in responding to many of the traumas we've experienced over these past few years and sending emails and acknowledging people's experiences. Many times folks went to lab spaces and say, my mentor actually didn't mention anything about the violence we saw on TV last night, but that felt important to me to want to acknowledge, or I'm experiencing this and no one in my space said anything about it. And so recognizing that we do have a responsibility to see that something has happened, understand that folks are impacted, and then recognize the signs and symptoms. So again, there are going to be person specific, but that's a really exhaustive list. And so being mindful and observant of people who we're interacting with to say, oh, that person was just, they required today more than normal. And it might be, okay, that event happened and they might be impacted by that. This might be relative to that experience. And then respond, right? And this is not calling people out or assuming that their disengagement that day is connected to a trauma response, but to say, I want to acknowledge that shooting that happened. I want to acknowledge that someone was hurt or harmed. I want to acknowledge that people are losing their homes in this natural disaster, or that people are still losing their lives to COVID and the pandemic. And so being able to say that you have self-awareness to speak on it in a way that feels supportive, but it also honors people's experiences, which is important as just being human beings. And then resist the urge to re-traumatize people. I think it's the moment that we sometimes might think we're doing a good thing or saying something that's helpful or putting people on the spot to speak about their individualized experience that might not be always helpful for folks. And so it's good to know how people want to be supported in our space so that we aren't re-traumatizing them. This could be making them speak for that on the behalf of a community. This might be making them share things about how they're doing that they don't feel comfortable doing, or actually telling someone that, it's not that big of a deal. That happens all the time. That can cause a re-traumatization because they're having a response. It is a big deal for them, and we want to be able to acknowledge that. And then you have to understand that recovery takes time and it can be compounded by chronic trauma. It's that moment where we might say, oh, yes, we talked as a group about this. I'm not sure why people are still stuck on that. Or, someone loses a loved one and you're like, that's just a part of life. It is a part of life, right? But it doesn't mean that we don't give time to people to recover. And it also doesn't mean that people are going to get over it in the time frame that we want them to, because they might have other traumas that are compounded by this new loss. And so acknowledging that people have a history and they will need their own unique amount of time. Protective factors. So this is kind of like the silver lining in all of this. It's like, okay, I've shared all these symptoms. I've told you how it's impacted people in the workspace, but recognizing that even though the community might be difficult to navigate due to some of the stressors that people face, or that the world is often in turmoil, but we often have these protective features in our communities and our individual selves that allow us to respond to trauma. And the better able we are to respond to trauma is going to be really that resilience factor that people are able to build, where then it doesn't take as long to recover, or recovery doesn't feel as difficult, or, recognizing that people are able to make more progress in their recovery when they're leaning into their protective features or traits. And so on the individual level, a supportive environment and social connection goes a long way when it comes to responding to a trauma from an individual level or a collective perspective. The ability to be resourceful and effective at problem solving, this one can be difficult because, as you've seen, your faculties can be impaired by a trauma experience. And so you might not always be able to tap into being resourceful or problem solving effectively in the moment. So that might mean you want to use your social connection or other supports in your environment there. But one of the pieces to remember is that if you're resourceful, you're always resourceful, even if it doesn't feel that you are. And so remembering that self-confidence and that self-efficacy in those difficult times can be helpful. Healthy coping tools. Many times when we experience trauma, we don't always enlist the coping tools that are helpful, right? Avoidance is a big one, as I mentioned earlier, but if my natural inclination is to avoid, to say, I actually have a really good toolbox of healthy coping tools. How do I access this? And if I can't, who can help me do that? And that leads to the next point of accessing your resources and engage those help-seeking behaviors. This can be difficult, whether it's a power dynamic in the relationship that you are in and you're experiencing that trauma, or you might say, I don't really feel good about asking for help because that creates shame and guilt for myself. But the ability to access your resources and lean into those help-seeking behaviors really does help speed up a recovery when it comes to a trauma experience. On the collective level, I think that the collective level is just as important as the individual level. The ability to have that strong, positive community of relationships to say, I'm having a hard time with how this is impacting me. I feel comfortable to speak to a colleague or a supervisor or a resource in the community. And those relationships are things that allow people to, again, experience that social connection, but also help them navigate some of the difficult pieces that might be the result of a trauma. Effective and transparent communication norms. If we live and work in environments where we have transparent and effective communication, it allows people to navigate and move through trauma in a way that they have a sense of control and understanding. And that really allows them to really harness the resourcefulness and problem-solving skills that they have. Accessible resources. And now this is important to acknowledge. A community might have resources, right? But if there is a lot of activation energy to get connected to them, or the resources might not provide the competency that you would hope when you go to get that help, you want to make sure that the resources are accessible for folks. And so communities that do offer that are going to give that individual the support that they need, but also the community support that might be needed for everyone involved or even tangentially related. And then available accommodations or flexibility. Each institution has a different expectation. There are laws that also kind of help support accommodations depending upon people's conditions, but general flexibility, giving folks the benefit of the doubt, leaning into empathy can really go a long way. For what individuals can do. Some folks process stress different than others, right? That means we also perceive our trauma different than others. And so you want to recognize that as an individual, you want to have an understanding of that. And so you can do that through mindfulness practices, help-seeking behaviors, well-being habits. The more resilient you are is really the investment in those habits, and then the mental health concerns. And so really recognizing how this is showing up for you as an individual is important. Engaging self-compassion and patience. I think patience is a virtue that many folks always wish they had more of, right? But that moment that you have to recognize that healing and recovery takes time, and self-compassion, where you might say, this is taking longer than I wanted, or why can't I be as productive as I was before? Or, judging yourself poorly for not being able to concentrate as much as you would normally. Using that self-compassion to say, today is a rough day. I'll give it a go tomorrow, or I just need to take time to regroup, get some water, go for a walk, and reset myself. All those pieces can be helpful when you're moving forward and responding to a trauma. Identifying appropriate supports in your personal life and at work. And appropriate is important because sometimes we don't always share with the right folks or ask the right people the right questions. So you want to recognize that the people that are helping you are actually helping you, right? And so then that moment where you say, oh, I told so-and-so, and then it might have not been so-and-so's job or in their purview, or they didn't have enough information. Or sometimes we share with folks who make things a little bit more difficult for us. So really assessing who are the supports in your life and how do you best access them is important. And you want to be able to effectively communicate what is necessary. When we experience traumas, our mental health and our well-being, they're very personal, right? So we want to find the right language to communicate what is helpful and what's needed when it comes to being in the work environment. And that's talking to your mentors, talking to peers, talking to colleagues, understanding what you need to communicate and where maybe you might want to have a confidential resource or a mental health provider or a well-being expert to be able to really help you there. And then being able to give yourself, again, that self-compassion to know that prioritizing your self-care and those healthy connections will really allow you to navigate the stress that comes from the trauma response that feels difficult to kind of impair functioning or cause those other symptoms of what could potentially happen. Allyship, this is a point where people don't always think about, like, how can I help? It might be awkward. You don't quite know what to say, but you want to make sure that your allyship is collaborative. You talk with people, you ask them what their needs are, you encourage them to reach out to enlist you for support, and recognizing there might be limitations, especially in the workplace, but being able to say, if you need someone to chat with, or here's how I can help, just reach out. But you want to also get that person's permission. We don't want to say, oh, this is what they need. I know this is what they need. I'm going to help them with this. Because one of the things are when we experience trauma, we can sometimes feel that lack of control, and allowing people to do this collaboratively helps empower that person. And it also helps empower communities. Again, being trustworthy and transparent with your communication, wanting to emphasize physical, psychological, emotional safety, and really practicing cultural humility and active listening skills, because we aren't always experts and we don't always have the answer. And so we want to be open and we want to validate folks and their experiences. And then being aware of the impacts of trauma on others, but also the vicarious trauma that we might experience in regards to supporting others. What leaders can do. I think often people don't know what to do as leaders or as institutions. And so I think it's important to start with the basics, right? Acknowledge what has happened. It's that moment where people might feel uncomfortable with the topic or the event, or they don't know what to say, so they say nothing. And saying nothing is not the best way to support a community. And it also doesn't send a message to people that you care about them and that you care about their experiences. So you want to acknowledge what happens. We want to start the conversation. We don't want to always put the onus on the person experiencing a trauma to start the conversation. And so being proactive and finding language in which you can show that you have a concern for someone's well-being, lean into the emotional intelligence building pieces so that you can take lead and say, hey, I saw this on the news, or I know that this is where you're from, and I want to help you in any way that I can. It doesn't have to be a long preamble, right? It's that moment where you want to center someone's experience, and that can be very simple. Ask employees and trainees what they need, and if appropriate, helping them strategize and plan. This could be as simple as maybe someone has lost a parent and they must travel home for that funeral, and to say, I want to check in what feels good as a re-entry plan when you come back. Or someone who, takes a maternity leave and has a difficult delivery, who might need a little bit more time. Or when we're out of the groove of being in science or being in the space, it might not feel as natural as it did before. So helping folks strategize and inviting them in as partners to do so. Practicing patience and flexibility, sharing relevant resources. The best leader is the person who knows what resources are at their fingertips, not just for themselves, but also for those they are leaders for and with. And so thinking about, what are the resources? Do you know them? How do you access them? Monitoring staff well-being and check-in. It's that moment where people might say, oh yeah, I didn't even know that was happening in that person's life. But if we make it a practice to monitor the well-being of staff and check in with folks, have some of those personal relationships that are work appropriate, check in when you can, or follow up after an event. Those are all basic things. Being aware of signs of trauma and stress, and then engaging the institutional resources. It's the moment where we're not asking you to be mental health professionals or well-being professionals, but those often exist at your institution to say, oh, I'm actually going to reach out to this resource because they can give me individual help, but they also can help me to help my trainees or help the folks that I'm leading. And then reminding employees and trainees of the resources, right? So again, if you know what the resources are, you then can say, hey, it seems like you're experiencing a little bit of stress. It might be helpful to reach out to these folks, or whatever that warm handoff looks like for you. As an institution, I think this is one of the pillars in which OITE really functions. It's building a resilient culture, because the more resilient we are as an individual, but also as a collective, we're then going to be better able to navigate trauma or stress or whatever life might bring to us as individuals and as a group. And so by reducing stigma or developing a group of folks who focus on student well-being or training well-being, or just the community in general around bias or acts of discrimination, all those things are important because they send a message to the culture, one, but they also help build a more resilient culture. And then hosting programs. You might say, oh, we don't have the resources for that, or we don't have an office that does that. But there are folks that you can enlist to say, oh, we'll bring a speaker to talk about well-being. And then you want to be consistent with it. Many times people host one-off programs, and it's like, okay, we did our due diligence. And it's remembering that trauma is a process, mental health and well-being maintenance is a process. And so those programs should be continuous. Assessing for current factors and traits that can lead to workplace trauma. And that's that moment where we all have different vulnerabilities in our community that can create trauma for folks, but also saying, okay, I'm gonna assess for it. We know the factors, we know all of the risks that are involved in these environments, but what are you gonna do to address it, right? And that becomes the collective responsibility and accountability as an institution. And so it's that piece of, yes, you are taking onus of it, but you're also going to be held accountable for it, and who and what are the systems at play to make sure that you are going to be accountable. Creating a response guide or protocol. What's nice is that, we can say when a trauma happens, this is how we want to respond as an institution. This is how we want to respond as a community. And that can be unique to each of the experiences, right? And you might need to check in to say, is this appropriate for this specific experience? But if you have a guide or a protocol, you aren't starting over, you aren't starting a new conversation each time. You want to develop your leaders. Many times folks are in managerial positions and they're not the best equipped at peopling, or they might not know how to manage some of the stress tolerance that they might need to really be an effective leader. So you want to develop your leaders to have empathy, to develop those communication skills, and for them themselves to practice well-being habits, because we do know that leaders, if they are unwell, they won't be able to help. And sometimes they create some of the problem or the trauma that exists in a workplace. You want to develop and bolster the safe spaces. And that might be, trainees wanting a space for trainees to mentor others, right? Or the moment where you might say, this is a campus resource that we have, but it's underfunded. So understanding that the existence of spaces also requires the bolstering to make sure that they are maintained. Improve diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, increase social support, provide support professionals with training. And that's the moment where you might have a counseling center, wellness advisors, employee assistants. You want to make sure those folks have the training to support the population, but you also want to make sure they have the resources for staffing and funding to do the work that they're doing to help build that culture of resilience. And then considering developing a peer support network. Sometimes that can be on the onus of the peers themselves, but sometimes we do need institutional go-aheads or support or funding in order for that to, or even purview and supervision to make that happen. So recognizing that that might be appropriate in some spaces and not in others. So that is it for what I have today.